one of the things that occurred to me when I was asked to speak on the future of the cloud is an implied arrogance in the title. I don't know it is the future. I just think of it as a future. In thinking about it as a future and trying to come up with something that would appeal to a heterogeneous environment, I spent time initially studying what I consider the concerns people are talking about in the cloud, and then trying to visualize a state when those concerns could be dealt with radically differently. In that context, I had no choice but to say that the traditional kind of problems people had or perceived in terms of cloud adoption were to do with security, governance, interoperability, service reliability, privacy and confidentiality, the underlying financial stability of the firms. Most of the things that you probably heard as barriers to cloud for a very long time. But one of the things that struck me was even looking at the word cloud itself, and then remembering the kind of metaphors we use to describe the internet, remembering the kind of metaphors we've used to describe the web, that a lot of the time we're dealing with natural analogies. We're trying to learn something from nature in terms of how we're describing the theories behind where we're trying to go. And so what I started experimenting with, and that's what I'm going to share with you today, is what it felt like to start taking that analogy a little more seriously. Because, it's clear that we live in an environment with more connections than we've ever had before, more devices than we've ever had before, and the implied risk and instability that would generate. And the theme song that I sort of got stuck with, which I guess is the underlying theme for the next 20 minutes or so, after which I try and open up to questions, is that nature doesn't do SLAs. Okay? What if we started imagining a cloud where the concept of the SLA was not intrinsic to what we offered or delivered? Right? We're spending so much time trying to create constructs where we almost sort of live in an age of physics and of predictability, of control, of a level of certainty in what we do. What if we shifted to say, actually, the cloud isn't like that, or that's not where the cloud is moving? The cloud is intrinsically more organic, and the lessons that we have to learn will themselves only be learned if we start throwing away these things that we're currently considering to be weaknesses and constraints, and actually start considering them strengths, considering them actually innate characteristics of what we're dealing with. And more than anything else, I guess a small number of you, either via Twitter or physically, might have been there when I spoke at the Enterprise 2.0 session in Boston a few weeks ago. And what I decided to speak on there was designing for loss of control. And it's that same theme that I want to pick up in trying to expose where I think the cloud is going. So we start with this premise that nature doesn't do SLAs. Right? What does that actually mean? Well, what happens if all the energy that we're currently dealing with is actually a variant on creating an artificial scarcity where it doesn't exist? That in order to establish a level of predictability and control, we're actually throwing away a lot of the intrinsic value of what we have. That starts really worrying me if that is true. And I then looked at the trends and said, wow, one of the ways people try to describe the 21st century is it's the age of biology and ecology rather than the age of physics. And I'm not trying to demean physics or suddenly assume that physics is sort of less chaotic or less blurred at the edges than biology, but that the way we characterize the 20th century has been about a level of control and predictability, and that may be just less true of moving from the vertical integration and controls we've had to the horizontal sort of high sort of cohesion, loose coupling that we're entering. Because then you have to be a lot smarter than you used to be in order to come up with anything that looks like an SLA. The shifts and moves have been spoken about by many people in many different contexts. You know, the John Seeley Brown, John Hagel, they've been working on the shift index and the idea that we're moving from stocks to flows in terms of how we visualize the world. That actually we're moving from a linear approach to things to a non-linear. You know, one of the environments I try and learn a lot from is through 21st century gaming. Not by spending 8-10 hours a day playing. I wish I had the freedom or the privilege of being able to do that. But understanding how you would design for a film, which was fundamentally a linear sequential experience, and how that same cinematographic experience looks fundamentally different when you design in a Red Dead Redemption or its equivalent, because the environment is suddenly so deeply nonlinear. What you have to predict that the participant does, the essential participative nature of consumption, which is again quite different from being a member of the audience in the historical sequential way of doing things. The teamwork and community that gets used in building today's 21st century games, how it's actually small pieces loosely joined rather than a deeply integrated single team. There are many parallels with what I saw as game development, where again people were learning more from nature than from the predictive, sequential, workflow type systems. So I started looking at it more, and again, the industry that I feel I've been part of for the last 30-odd years loves sort of polarizing debates, right? Every opportunity we get, we go to extremes, and it was Microsoft versus open source at one time. Right now, maybe it's Apple versus Google. I don't almost care what, just that we have this tendency to polarize. And yet, the world we're preparing for, the future that I'm looking into, is very much one of hybrids. It's neither open nor closed, but both. It's neither real nor virtual, but both. Right? It's the singularity in that sense is actually here. It's an internet of people and an internet of things. It's both individual as well as collective. It is not just cloud, but it's ground as well. It's what's in your pocket at the same time. And we cannot keep wanting to view this world through just one extreme in the polarization. And nature is very good at having to accept and work with the apparent conflicts of dealing with the two extremes at the same time, because that's where we're sort of learning about handling those conflicts. Right? The position we land up with is saying that, if I suddenly stop thinking of a closed system world, and I started thinking a lot more about, open, complex, adaptive subsystems, heuristic with a learning capacity, self-repairing, self-healing, self-aware, right? Now you suddenly start beginning to see what the cloud, as we call it, has to be. Because the alternative will actually go back to what we see almost attempted every day, which is a reversion to the vertical integrated stacks that I started my computing with. Because the trade-off always happens to be, if you want that predictability, if you want that control, then end-to-end, this is what we expect. And whether it's Microsoft at one end or Apple at the other, whenever I start getting involved in any debate about what the stack would look like, and I'm intrigued to see more of where OpenStack goes in that context. My fear, my concern, is that in the interests of the worries that we've established are the reasons for a weakness in take-up of the cloud. We revert to type rather than genuinely evolve into something new. So when I started thinking about designing for loss of control, where I started going with it was saying, maybe at a level of abstraction, the internet was fundamentally always about best efforts. It was always about being frail and weak in its essence. And then people built things that were initially relatively simple standards to get around it, right? To find some way of making something that frail and that weak more predictable. And you have to be careful how you do that, because if you go back to the singularity type questions, there is a lot of evidence that says that as soon as you can take any market segment and its behavior and express it as a set of mathematical models, then the ability to simulate and the ability to visualize, to virtualize, gets so much greater that innovation takes off at breakneck speed. And if I look at medicine and the implication of the genome and where we're going, I can feel good thinking about it. But if I hark back 30 years and look at how that form of dematerialization took place in finance, then actually the mess that we found ourselves in the 21st century was actually caused by our not knowing where the genie actually left the bottle when we started creating these mathematical models of our trades and their interrelationships and what we did. And we start using terms like black swans to sort of explain, again, it's a natural analogy, to say we're so perfect at predicting everything that's going to happen, we need to have a class that says, and what if we were wrong? Or we call that a black swan. Right? Well, cloud's going to have its black swans if it's not careful, because the unintended consequences of complex adaptive systems entering chaotic states, right? Just through general happenstance, I hear tales that there was a Skype outage a couple of years ago in Europe where the outage appeared to be because a higher than expected percentage of supernodes in Europe were also Vista trialists. So when a whole bunch of them sort of got rebooted at the same time as a patch write, there was an impact on Skype availability. I get told of instances where Pakistan is accused of playing around with YouTube when all that somebody did was a national ISP used an HTTP redirect to say, verboten, banned, you cannot go to this site. And some agent in Singapore, no human involved, says, 2 hops to YouTube, I'll take that. And before you know it, 40% of the world's YouTube traffic is being directed towards Pakistan. Right? These are the sort of unintended consequences that are going to take place because we don't have that end-to-end control. And so when we start designing on it, even wireless, 802.11, is intrinsically designed to be broken, right? To take care of relative frailty and weakness. So and I remember, at Web 2.0 last October, Tim Berners-Lee was being interviewed by Tim O'Reilly. And Tim O'Reilly asked the question, of all the things that you decided very early on with the web, what do you think was the most important decision? And Tim Berners-Lee replied, 404, file not found. Okay? Because there was a lot of pressure on him not to allow for that, to say everything's going to be perfect when it actually gets mounted on the web, so to say. Instead of which, the organic behavior of the web was much better captured by allowing for the file not found condition. And these are the sort of things that actually militate against SLAs. Once you start thinking about the implied frailty, right? Not that the frailty is what you take for granted, but that the smarts have to come in and how we build ecosystems to try and cope with that. And governance through ecosystems is actually, a non-trivial subject. A couple of years ago, I was asked to write an essay for something called the Publius Project at the Berkman Center about the governance of the internet. And the simile I used was again from nature, because I'm trying to spend as much time as I can understanding and studying nature to see where I want to go. And the thesis that a bunch of researchers put forward about 40 years ago was that every plant has a unique pest and parasite pairing. So when you move a plant from one place to another, you have to discover what that unique pest and what that unique parasite is, because the governance model was actually tripartite rather than bipartite, right? The role of the parasite was to protect the plant from the pest. So the plant was the host, and the parasite resided on the host. And the role of the pest was to make sure that parasite numbers did not grow to such an extent that it smothered the plant. And sometimes when I think of where we're going with security to do with the cloud, I start seeing the idea of individual plants with pests and parasites a lot more interesting than the sort of perimeterized approaches we've taken so far, because there is some symbiosis and some equilibrium to be caused, and it's an unstable equilibrium that reflects nature a lot more. There are many other elements to it, besides the unreliability and the unpredictability, the implications of saying we're going to move towards something that's more ecological in its origin, natural selection. Now, when I was a kid, I had this challenge of saying, why do people want to save whales? Okay? If survival of the fittest was the most important thing, why are there so many movements about saving species that are expiring, as it were? Is it not true that new species keep emerging and old species, exit stage left? What is it that we as human beings have suddenly discovered differently, if we believe in evolution by natural selection, to intervene? And the only logical conclusion I could come to was that nature was capable of holding this balance at nature's pace. And we were doing things that was upsetting nature's pace, so now we needed to own up and participate within that process. And that then led to a deeper understanding of why we would need seed banks. Okay, a guy called Cary Fowler spent a lot of time hoarding seeds 60 meters under the ice somewhere in Sweden. And when I looked into that, it was to future-proof. It was to make sure that the seeds needed for conditions that we have not experienced today, for which natural selection has meant that the strains have died or could die, we reserve to say, you know what, there could be events in the future for which those seed strains that could have died need to be preserved. And I start beginning to think of the evolution of cloud systems and ecosystems that way, to say, what are the strains that appear unimportant today, but needs to be carefully preserved, because we do not actually know where this ecosystem is going. We do not know about the ecological balance that we are seeking. Because up to now, we've been playing terminology, taxonomy, and ontology. We're almost at the Linnaean stage of understanding the cloud and its participants, because it's about labeling, right? Almost every cloud conference I've been to for the last 2 years starts with people arguing about the definition of cloud. Do me a favor. We need to move on from those. And the only way we can is to start looking at the cloud from a completely different perspective. One of the other elements of the cloud, which I think we're going to have to start seeing the tools emerge and understand for, is to do with human intelligence. There's been a lot of talk up to now about the web and Google and what have you, all being accused of dumbing us down. And I think that the unstated question, which I've now begun to work on, is whether it's actually a dumbing down of the individual and a smartening up of the collective. Because we have to learn much more to work as collectives in what we do. And the lessons we have to learn, the tools that we have to have, the kind of feedback loops we would have in community systems that are supporting clouds are much more to do with making us smarter as us rather than as a series of I's. Okay, we're learning a lot again from nature to say individual strains of bacteria appear almost pheromonally to signal and connect with each other and are made aware of when they reach critical mass in order to attack the system they are present in at the point they would choose to attack. And it's a leaderless swarm-type behavior, but it is deeply based on signaling. And the signaling is not individual signaling as we would know. It's collective signaling. And as we get more point-to-point, peer-to-peer in the approaches of what we put in the cloud, then our signaling also has to evolve in ways that we aren't doing now, where copies of things are being kept in more than one place. The centralized approach isn't there. But the knowledge of where it is and how it is, the knowledge and status, when we start talking about self-referential, discovering, learning, adaptive, those meanings of those words are completely different if you start thinking that we're dealing with a community and a collective rather than individuals. There's also an implication in looking at how, say, bacteria operates again, of the importance of the semantic. Right? This kind of engagement would not take place unless there were at least some element of rule basis about what information was being transmitted. So trying to summarize and bring it down and trying to think of where all this is heading. I started thinking when I was reading the Facebook effect, I think one of the phrases to describe Facebook was the evolving communications infrastructure for the planet. Okay? Actually, that's what the cloud is. The cloud is the evolving communications infrastructure for the planet. But when you start seeing evolving infrastructure and planet, all these three words are a lot more important in the decade to come than we understand up to now. And it would mean we have to throw away a lot of the perspectives that we've had in looking at this up to now. We've already got virtual communities, we've already got virtual countries, we even have virtual clouds. The idea that we are now going to deal with, at least 2 or 3 collections of communities are now larger than all countries bar 2. And in the decade to come, we should expect virtual communities to be larger than India or China. That's already happening. So to summarize, I think where a personal perspective where the cloud is going is that it's becoming much more akin to nature. It is an adaptive, evolving, evolutionary learning, heuristic environment. That the concepts of control that we've historically had are irrelevant because it's a nonlinear 360 approach, that the thinking that we have to have has to move from individual to collective and participatory, and that the signaling that we need, the feedback loops and the underlying structure, is a lot more important. It's early days yet because we're still trying to be the control freaks of historical vertically integrated units, but I wanted to try, however vulnerable and stupid it may seem, to share amongst this kind of audience what I really thought rather than some sort of PowerPoint pat. Thank you for your time. Sure.
John, I believe you have one.
Yeah, so I thought the presentation was brilliant. And it's funny, I was at a conference about a month ago, Java conference, and there was a gentleman called Tim Berglund, and he gave a presentation called Complex Systems for Software Development. And he talked about emergence, and he talked about, like, a lot of these ideas of using, criticality and dancing landscapes for the software. And so I invited him on a DevOps Cafe to say, could this work with infrastructure? Is infrastructure getting so complex, right, that we need to, throw out the SLA rule and let, maybe best behavior emergence happen? And it sounds like that was where you were going with that presentation.
To take a completely non-cloud analogy, look at microcredit. Okay? Microcredit is a classic example of throwing out the SLA or the implied rules for how you lend, to actually say, we're going to have much lower barriers to entry for someone wanting money, and we're going to deal with the risk by sharing the risk across a much larger group, much smaller units. And what turned out to be the reality was this so-called unreliable lending to people who had no right to be lent to had a much higher degree of payback because the default rates were low. Now compare that to what happened in the financial world where there was control, right? And yet people who shouldn't have been lent to were lent to.
Okay, any questions? Aha.
Yeah, that was really fascinating. I'm a fan of both cloud and the natural world. One of my own personal perspectives on cloud has been that although some of the large vendors are trying to constantly reintegrate the stack, there is now the option to disintegrate the supply chain and have your infrastructure from one provider, your platform from another, potentially under your software from yet another, and then the help desk from yet a fourth. And that could potentially provide a number of benefits. But obviously we see that in the natural world as well, where an ecosystem is formed from many components. So do you see that componentization that you seem to be referring to applying sort of vertically through the stack as well as horizontally?
Yes, I think that the vertical is nothing more than an orthogonally viewed set of horizontal slices in that kind of argument. And you will see emergence of people trying to have almost learning wheels to say there's going to be an implied vertical control, almost like how a mother bird would teach the baby birds to forage and to fly before letting it out of the nest. So control is not going to disappear, and some of the emergent ways we're going to deal with that is going to see some modern semblance of vertical continue. Right? It's again going back to, don't go baby in bathwater, don't go polarized. I haven't suddenly turned around and said, all vertical is evil. But the approach that we were currently seeing, that under the guise of sort of pandering to SLAs and securities, we were calmly recreating the proprietary stacks of the past, that we need to avoid. But the intermediate stages may have other reasons for vertical being a route there. See, one of the arguments I use is saying Android could not have existed if iPhone hadn't been there first, right? That Linux may not have existed if Microsoft hadn't gone there first. That the Google Voice could not have existed if Skype hadn't gone there. There is a way of trying to deal with a past monopoly that requires a level of control to break that monopoly before the emergence of real innovation might take place. So there are reasons to allow verticals to continue, but not to dominate.
So we've actually got pretty much no time left. I've got one very last question. C.D. Brown, they wrote the book Push.
Yeah.
Isn't it really not a question of push versus pull, but most organizations are both. They contain both linear and non-linear elements to them. That it's not as simple as Agile versus Six Sigma, but it's both. It's not as simple as
I think if you read The Power of Pull, it's really bringing much more the view that it has been so biased and corrupted towards one extreme that we almost need to over-accentuate the other in order to bring some form of equilibrium, however unstable, right? The essence here of saying I'm moving towards a more natural way of perceiving things is not because I think the physics is wrong, but that having stayed with a much more predictable, controlled way of trying to visualize all this has caused us more pain than pleasure, and it's time to get some of the pleasure. Thank you.
That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much, JP. Please put your hands together.